Welcome to AI Paper Podcasts. Today we're looking at a really interesting paper called Continuous Autoregressive Language Models, or CAL.
That's the one. It's by Chenzi Xiao, Darren Li, Fandong Meng, and Jizhu from WeChat AI and Tencent.
And the core problem they're tackling is something anyone working with LLMs knows well: efficiency, specifically the bottleneck of sequential token-by-token prediction.
Exactly. It's slow, it scales poorly with sequence length, and maybe surprisingly, it's very low bandwidth. Like the actual semantic information in one discrete token is tiny.
Yeah, the paper puts it at around 15 to 18 bits, which is kind of wild when you think about these massive models, all that computation for such small packets of meaning.
Right. So COM proposes a pretty fundamental shift. Forget predicting the next token, predict the next vector.
A continuous vector. And they do this using a high-fidelity autoencoder. It takes a chunk of tokens, let's say dollar tokens, maybe 4.
Yeah, K45 is one example they use.
And compresses them into a single vector. And the key is this compression has to be almost perfect, like over 99.9% accurate reconstruction.
And if you can do that, the efficiency gain is immediate. You reduce the number of generation steps by that factor of dollars.
So 4 times faster in that example. The paper really positions this next vector prediction as a scalable path forward. They show results like, 44% fewer training FLOPs?
Yeah, compared to standard discrete models for similar performance. It establishes this chunk size, dollars, as a whole new way to scale these models alongside parameters and data.
Okay, that's the high-level pitch. Let's dig into why this token bottleneck is such a big deal.
Well, the computational cost, especially for inference, is just huge because you have to run the whole model, essentially, for every single token you want to generate.
And historically, we tried to improve this, right? Moving from words to subwords helped pack more meaning per step.
It did, yeah. Subwords increase the information density, but there's a fundamental limit to that approach in the discrete world.
Because if you wanted, say, one token to represent a whole phrase or sentence,
your vocabulary would just explode. It'd have to cover every possible phrase. Exponential growth.
And that makes the final computation step, the softmax layer that picks the next token, totally impractical. It just doesn't scale.
Exactly. You're fundamentally limited by that discrete vocabulary size. Continuous vectors, though, they offer a way out.
How so?
Instead of making the vocabulary bigger, you just make the vector dimension dollars larger. You can increase the information capacity much more gracefully. It's a more scalable way to handle complexity.
So CNM reframes the task. Instead of 2 tokens one by one, you group them. Tokens become wall dollar ISIK vectors. Let's call them ZOZD equals ZO ISI2.CLE.
And the model's job changes. Now it predicts the next vector. The sequence it has to process is shorter by a factor of tuple.
Makes sense conceptually, but getting this to work in practice, that sounds tricky. First step is that autoencoder you mentioned.
Right. You need this mapping function, an encoder that takes dollar tokens to a vector in more dollars, and a decoder that goes back. And critically, that round trip has to be super accurate, over 99.9%.
Okay, high accuracy, sure. But the paper talks about another problem, something called brittle representation. What's that about?
Ah, yeah, that's crucial. If you just train a standard autoencoder to reconstruct perfectly, the mapping it learns, it can be very jagged, irregular.
Jagged, like in the latent space.
Exactly. Think of the space of possible vectors. A simple autoencoder might create points that are close together for reconstruction, but the space between those points is chaos.
So if the main language model makes a tiny prediction error, maybe nudges the vector just slightly,
it could land in one of those chaotic gaps. And then the decoder might output something completely nonsensical, totally unrelated to the intended tokens. Small error, huge output failure. Brittle.
Okay, that makes sense. Small errors, catastrophic results. So how do they make it robust?
They switch to a variational autoencoder, a VAE. It's a pretty standard technique, but key here.
Instead of outputting a single point vector, the encoder outputs parameters for distribution, like a mean and variance.
Precisely. 0 lowers is sampled from a Gaussian Dibu, segment 2. And then they add a KL divergence loss term, LibL.
What does that do?
It penalizes the encoder if the distribution it learns deviates too much from a simple standard normal distribution. It basically forces the learned vectors to be spread out more smoothly, more regularly.
Ah, so it smooths out that jagged landscape.
Exactly. Now, if there's a small prediction error, the slightly nudged vector is likely still close to other meaningful vectors, not lost in some weird gap. It makes the whole thing much more stable for the downstream model.
Got it. And they also mentioned KL clipping. Lambda KL 255, why was that needed?
That's to fight something called posterior collapse. Sometimes, especially with powerful decoders, a VAE can learn to just ignore the input vector zillers. Some dimensions become useless, just noise.
Okay.
The KL clipping puts a minimum penalty in the KL divergence. It forces the model to actually use all the dimensions of the latent vector CLR to store information for reconstruction. Keeps all Diller dimensions active and meaningful.
Clever. But they didn't stop there for robustness, right? There was dropout involved, too.
Two kinds, yeah. First, they applied dropout directly to the latent vector vector itself during autoencoder training. About 15% dropout rate.
Why drop out the vector?
It forces redundancy. If some dimensions are randomly zeroed out, the autoencoder has to learn to represent the information across the remaining dimensions. So the final representation is less fragile. It can tolerate some noise or error coming from the main generative model later on.
Makes sense. And the second dropout?
Input token dropout, also 15%. This means the autoencoder sometimes has to reconstruct the full sequence of dollar tokens, even when some of them were masked out in the input.
Ah, so it has to use the context of the other tokens in the chunk to figure out the missing ones.
Exactly. It forces the latent vectors, a Diller order, to capture more semantic relationships within that chunk of dollar tokens. Kind of like how CBOW works in word embeddings, but happening inside the autoencoder.
That's quite neat. And the specifics. For K44, how big did the vector dollar need to be?
Surprisingly small, actually. Only 128A wide dimensions. And this autoencoder part is lightweight overall, maybe 75 million parameters.
And it still hit that 99.9% accuracy, even with all the regularization and dropout.
Yep. And crucially, it remained accurate even when they deliberately added noise to the latent vector, simulating prediction errors. Show the robustness strategies really worked.
Okay, so we have a robust way to map tokens to vectors and back. Now for the main event. Training the language model to predict these vectors. This seems like the biggest hurdle.
It is, because predicting a continuous vector Zizzlin in a high-dimensional space like $420, well, calculating the probability it's Zizzly is basically intractable. You can't easily define a probability density over that space.
Which means?
Standard training methods are out, maximum likelihood estimation using cross-entropy loss. That relies entirely on having those probabilities. So you can't use it here.
Okay, no cross-entropy. And you also mentioned that the generative part needs to be single step, right? No diffusion models or anything iterative?
Exactly. If generating one vector 6govr takes multiple steps, you lose the whole efficiency gain you got from chunking tokens in the first place. You'd just be replacing one bottleneck with another.
So single-step generation and no likelihoods. How on earth do you train it then?
They turn to something called strictly proper scoring rules, or SPSRs. It's a concept from statistics. Instead of maximizing likelihood, you frame training as maximizing the expected score according to one of these rules.
And that's equivalent to matching the true data distribution.
Mathematically, yes. If you maximize the expected score of an SPSR, your model's predictions will converge to the true underlying distribution clobble.
Which SPSR did they use?
The energy score. It's a likelihood-free SPSR, which is perfect for this situation. It basically works by measuring distances between samples.
Distances? How does that work as a loss?
The loss function, laudal energy, has two main terms. Think of it this way. One term encourages the model's generated samples to be close to the actual target samples. That's the fidelity part.
Driving predictions towards the ground truth. Makes sense.
The other term looks at the distances between the model's own generated samples. It penalizes the model if all its samples are clustered too closely together. This encourages diversity, preventing the model from just outputting the same vector every time.
Ah, so it balances accuracy and diversity using distances in the vector space? That's elegant.
It is. But calculating these expected distances exactly is still hard. So they estimate it using Monte Carlo sampling.
Sampling?
Yeah, they draw a few samples, say NA Drowler, from what the model currently predicts. And then they draw a lot more samples, like M100 from the target distribution. Remember, the target sample comes from the VAE encoder, so we know its distribution, that Gaussian mu sigma twi.
So they use these batches of samples to estimate the energy score loss. Why so many target samples M100?
For stability. Estimating distances in high-dimensional space needs a good number of points to be reliable. M100 helps ensure the loss calculation isn't too noisy.
Okay, that's the loss. What about the model architecture that actually predicts Zedgedraller, the generative head?
They call it the energy transformer. It's essentially a stack of residual MLP blocks. It takes the transformer's hidden state from the previous step and an initial random noise vector and processes them to output the predicted vector Zedgedraller in the right dimension, Dillabest. It's also relatively lightweight, maybe 10% of the total model parameters.
But there's a crucial detail about feeding information between steps, right? The discrete feedback loop. You can't just feed the predicted vector z to 1 back into the main transformer.
No, apparently that really hurts performance. If you feed the continuous, possibly slightly noisy vector z to 1 form directly as input for predicting z to 1, the transformer struggles. It seems transformers work best with more token-like discrete-ish inputs, even after embedding.
So what's the workaround?
It's clever. You take the predicted vector z to 1, you run it through the decoder part of the frozen autoencoder.
The one trained earlier.
Yes, the frozen high-fidelity decoder.
Yeah.
This gives you back the discrete tokens that z1 represents. It cleans up the signal.
Ah, back to the stable discrete space momentarily.
Exactly. Then they use a small separate MLP to compress those dollar tokens back into a single vector embedding. That embedding is what gets fed into the main transformer to predict the next vector, zixed out.
So you generate continuously, but you feed back discretely after decoding and re-embedding. That maintains stability while still getting the call-fold speed up.
Precisely. It's a really key architectural choice.
Okay, brilliant. We can train it. Now, evaluation. Same problem, right? No likelihoods means no perplexity.
Correct. Perplexity is the standard, but it's fundamentally based on log likelihoods. Can't use it for CALA.
So they needed another metric.
They adopted the Brier score. Like the energy score, it's another SPSR, but it's well suited for evaluation. It naturally balances accuracy, how often the prediction matches the true outcome with calibration or uncertainty.
How does it measure uncertainty without probabilities?
That's the clever part. They use a likelihood-free estimator for the Brier score that works using only samples from the model. You just need to draw 2 samples, 6 to large 5, and the value in 2, 2 from the model's predicted distribution for a given context.
2 samples. How does that tell you anything?
The estimator looks at whether 6x matches the true target ceiling, whether 6x2a matches $1, and then subtracts a term based on whether 6x of honor and 6x happen to match each other. It sounds a bit weird, but it mathematically gives an unbiased estimate of the Brier score without needing Plowshare.
Fascinating. And they generalize this.
Yes, into a metric called BrierLM. It's basically the geometric mean of these sample-based Brier scores calculated for predicting the next 1, 2, 3, and 4 tokens, or rather, the chunk corresponding to them, scaled 0, 100.
So it evaluates the quality of predicting whole chunks, not just the very next token.
Exactly. And importantly, this BrierLM metric isn't just for calm. Because it's likelihood-free, you could use it to evaluate any model that generates text via sampling without explicit probabilities. Think text diffusion models, for example.
Provides a common benchmark, but is it reliable? Does it track with what we usually measure?
They showed it does. It has a very strong correlation with traditional cross-entropy loss Pearson correlation of Neresel 0.966. So lower, better BrierLM strongly corresponds to lower, better cross-entropy, like a valid evaluation approach.
Okay, great. We can train, we can evaluate. What about controlling the output, like temperature sampling?
Ah, yes. Standard temperature sampling works by rescaling the logits before the softmax. But Column doesn't compute logits or probabilities. It just gives you a sampler S that produces vectors, which decode to tokens.
It's a black box. So how do you control the randomness or creativity?
They came up with a really clever, if complex, method based on rejection sampling. They developed an algorithm 1 in the paper, that performs exact temperature sampling PTX. Propto-PX using only calls to the black box sampler Zillerwar.
How does that work?
It's a 2-stage process. They look at the exponent dollars an hour. First, they handle the integer part, let's say 1 lol, 1t r floor. To pass this stage, you have to call the sampler exactly $1 times and get the identical output sequence $6 all in times.
Wow. Okay, that sounds unlikely to happen often.
Especially if nullers is large, yes, the rejection rate is huge. If you pass that, you then deal with the fractional part, alpha equals 1t in a dollar. This involves more sampling and techniques related to something called the Bernoulli factory, essentially simulating a biased coin flip with probability alpha based only on samples from the earth.
So it's theoretically exact, but sounds incredibly inefficient in practice, especially for temperatures near 1 or very low temperatures where Neulor gets large.
It is. The expected number of samples needed can be enormous. So while it proves exact control is possible, it's not practical.
So what's the practical solution?
Algorithm 2, batch approximation. This gets around the high rejection rate, particularly for low temperatures, large nullers. Instead of trying many times to get null and identical samples in a row, you draw one large batch of samples, say size nuller, where nuller is much bigger than a batch.
A big batch. Then what?
You look within that batch. If you're aiming for DLR equals unslurs, you count how many times each unique output sequence $6 appears in the batch. Let's say a sequence appears L times that. If time dollars is greater than or equal to another dollar, then equal dollars is considered a potential candidate. In fact, it contributes binding candidates to the pool. You effectively collect all candidates from all sequences in the batch and then randomly select one final output from that pool.
Ah, using combinations. So if 2 none and 2 none in sequence A appeared 3 times, you get bind and 3 chances for A to be selected.
Exactly. It's a way to efficiently approximate the rejection sampling. And crucially, as the batch size not all dollar gets very large, this approximation becomes asymptotically unbiased. It converges to the true temperature dollar distribution.
And does it work empirically? Can you tune the batch size nuller to get the same kind of creativity versus accuracy trade-off you get by tuning temperature dollars in a normal transformer?
Yes, they show exactly that in the paper. Tuning the batch size nullers in CALM effectively replicates the behavior of tuning temperature dollars. So likelihood-free control generation is definitely practical.
Fantastic. Okay, that covers the whole mechanism. Let's get to the payoff, the results.
This is where it gets really compelling. Table 1 in the paper lays out the performance versus compute trade-off.
And it looks good for CALM.
Very good. For instance, their medium model, CalMM, with about 371 million parameters, achieved a similar BrierLM score to a standard transformer baseline, Transformer S, which had 281 million parameters.
Okay, slightly larger model.
But here's the kicker. CalM needed 44% fewer training FLOPs and 34% fewer inference FLOPs to reach that performance level.
Wow, 44% fewer training FLOPs. That's huge. That's potentially millions of dollars saved on training runs for large models.
Yeah.
And significant energy savings, too.
Absolutely. It's a massive efficiency gain, directly validating the core idea of continuous autoregression.
And this confirms their idea about paleo dollars, the chunk size, being a new scaling axis.
Definitely. They show results, I think it's figure 4, where they vary dollars going from KLN dollars, was like a standard model, to KLN DN2, almost halves the computational cost, with only a very small dip in performance.
And at K quant dollars.
At K, 2004, Ken clearly pushes past the efficiency frontier of the discrete baseline. It achieves better performance for the same amount of compute, or the same performance for significantly less compute.
So model builders now have another knob to turn, besides just model size and data size. They can tune dollars the semantic bandwidth per step.
Exactly. It's a third dimension for optimization.
What about the learning process itself? Does CALM learn differently?
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic shown in figure 5. CalM tends to start slower than the discrete baselines. Its initial loss reduction is less steep.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. The model first has to figure out how to predict vectors in this complex, high-dimensional, continuous space. And it has to learn the language modeling task itself. It's doing more upfront. The autoencoder helps, but the generative head still has a hard job initially.
Right, it's learning the representation and the sequence prediction.
But once it gets past that initial phase, once it has a good handle on the continuous vector space, the learning curve becomes steeper and more sustained than the discrete models.
Suggesting that once the continuous representation is learned, maybe it's easier or faster to model the underlying semantic relationships.
That seems to be the implication. Operating in that smooth, continuous space might allow for more efficient learning of complex patterns compared to hopping between discrete tokens.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. KLM seems like a really solid piece of work. It tackles a fundamental LLM bottleneck.
The token-by-token generation, yeah.
And it provides a complete framework, a robust way to create continuous representations using VAEs and dropout.
An energy-based, likelihood-free training method.
A new evaluation metric, BrierLM, that works without likelihoods.
And even a practical method for controlled, temperature-like sampling using batch approximation. It's end-to-end.
The big takeaway seems to be proving that vector-based autoregression is technically viable and significantly more computationally efficient. That feels really important for the future, especially as we want models to handle much longer contexts.
It could be a crucial step, but it also opens up a whole new set of questions.
Like what?
Well, think about many of the techniques we rely on now for improving and controlling LLMs. Things like reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, or knowledge distillation.
Right. They often involve directly manipulating probabilities or log probabilities, calculating ratios, adjusting distributions.
Exactly. But CALM doesn't compute those probabilities. It's likelihood-free. So the immediate challenge for the research community is, how do we adapt those foundational techniques? How do you do RLHF policy optimization or distill knowledge when all you have is a black box sampler spitting out vectors?
That's a really interesting point. We'd need entirely new algorithms, perhaps based purely on samples or scores like the Brier score, to replace the probability-based methods we use now.
Precisely. If continuous models like COM are going to become widespread, we need to figure out how to build the rest of the ecosystem around this likelihood-free paradigm. That's the next big research frontier this paper opens up.
A fascinating challenge indeed. A big thank you for walking us through the column paper.
My pleasure. It's definitely one to watch.